Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. If I may, could I ask some of you to please move forward? We don't bite over here, so you can you can move forward. Let's fill up some of these spaces. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I know it's a really cold day in Washington, D.C., and we pushed the time for this event as well, so we thank you for being here today. My name is Oge Onubogu, and I direct our Africa program here at the Wilson Center. Many of you are familiar with the Wilson Center and the Africa program, but for those of you who are joining us today for the first time, allow me to tell you a little bit about the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is a unique institution in foreign policy. We are congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, fiercely nonpartisan, and independent. Our Africa program addresses some of the most critical issues facing Africa and US-Africa relations. This is why today we are proud to launch the 10th edition of our annual Africa Year in Review publication. Each year, the Wilson Center Africa program partners with African and US-based policymakers, practitioners, scholars, and experts to publish impactful short essays reflecting on the most important developments across the African continent, in US-Africa relations, and on Africa's role in the global arena. This Africa Year in Review 2024 publication features reflections from key thought leaders on critical topics such as the ongoing war in Sudan, growing African leadership on the global stage, large-scale infrastructure projects, and one of the continent's biggest election years in 2024. Each of our authors has assessed the implications of these developments for the social and political futures of Africa, the United States, and the world at large. We're also excited for a fresh look for our 10th year, for the 10th year of this publication. We have a new cover and layout that was done by Kenyan artist Lulu Kitolo. And we hope to continue to use this publication to engage and highlight not only African and US perspectives on political, social, and economic relations, but also to spotlight the work of young African artists. I would also like to thank our Africa program staff, some of them who are in the room here today, Aaron Stanley, who is at the back, Nathaniel Oakes, Niat Afewerki, and Noel Boyd, all of whom were instrumental in completing this publication and organizing today's event. So, before we start, 2025 is already shaping up to be a very eventful year for Africa. In January alone, we saw the breakup of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. We also saw a flare-up of conflict in the Eastern DRC. With all of this, the African continent is expected to experience significant transformations across various sectors this year. Some important trends for us to watch include geopolitical dynamics, digital development, and security challenges that will shape the continent's future and global relations. These developments also indicate an African continent that is gaining prominence on the world stage and new opportunities for investment and business. All these developments present opportunities for the new Trump administration to renew, strengthen, and deepen its relationships with African countries. Our panelists for today's conversation are also contributors to the publication. And for those of you who picked up the publication outside, I hope you get a chance to read their short essays as well. Today, they will discuss a wide range of interconnected topics and delve deeper into the key issue areas of African governance, economic growth, peace and security, and development assistance as we look at what's at stake for Africa and U.S.-Africa relations in 2025. I'm delighted to introduce our panelist, Abigail Kabandula, who is the director of the Africa Center at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, Florie Lizer, who's the president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa, Jide Okeke, who is joining us online from Addis, Ethiopia, is the coordinator of the Regional Program for Africa at the UNDP, and Alex Vines, who is the research director and head of the Africa program at Chatham House in the UK. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Their full bios are included in the handouts that you all received on your way in. I also want to mention to the audience today, we value your input and your contributions to the conversation. We have over 200 people who have signed up online to join this discussion, and we want to make sure that we're able to collect questions from everyone. So in lieu of passing the microphone around today for questions, some of you may have received note cards on your way into the auditorium. If you didn't receive a note card and you would like one, please indicate. We ask that you use the note card to ask your question. Feel free to add your name and affiliation on the note card if you would like, and you can pass them to my colleague Aaron, who is over there, or other colleagues who might be in the room later on. So let's dive into the conversation. Florie, since you're next to me, I will start with you. As I've mentioned, there are opportunities as we look to 2025 for business and investment on the continent. I would love to hear, you've been at this in this space for a very long time when it comes to U.S. U.S.-Africa trade relations. What opportunities do you see that exist here in 2025?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of the Africa in Review 2024 and to add the voice of Corporate Council on Africa to those of many other experts, those here today, and others who are featured in the Year in Review 2024. Many, many things did happen across the continent, and as you noticed, Oge, 2025 is starting off quite an exciting year in different ways. I think some people are looking at some of the indications, the early indications from the second Trump administration about directions that they may be going in. But I think from Corporate Council on Africa's perspective, we are actually very hopeful about the kind of relationship that the United States can have with African countries across the continent. I'll remind folks that it was actually in the first Trump administration that Prosper Africa was launched. And the purpose of Prosper Africa was to bring together under one sort of banner all of the 17 different U.S. government agencies that are promoting U.S.-Africa trade, investment, and business so that they could all be operating in a collaborative way and accomplishing the goals of the first Trump administration. And I look forward to what can be possible through Prosper Africa and all of the 17 government agencies, again, working in this area in this administration. We already know also that the BUILD Act was passed during the first Trump administration. It transformed OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, into the U.S. Development Finance Corporation and took a piece of USAID and merged it there. And DFC has been doing some major things since its establishment during the first Trump administration. And so I saw the other day that a new director or CEO of the DFC has been appointed. That's exciting news. We're looking forward to that. So again, there are many opportunities in terms of business. The continent offers tremendous opportunities as a market. And we, the U.S. Private sector, has been focused on the continent and what it offers. So there are many sectors that we are already investing in Africa that are benefiting both Africans as well as the U.S., our workers, our businesses, both large and small, the health sector, energy, ICT and digital infrastructure. These are all areas where I think we have a chance. And in some important supply chains like critical minerals, where the U.S. has a lot of the insight and technology that can be used to promote those kinds of supply chains and make them more resilient for the benefit of the U.S., our economic security. So I'll stop there, but I am very positive about what can happen in this relationship. And, we stand ready at CCA to work with the new administration as well as the new Congress to advance the U.S., Africa, America First agenda that is so important.
Thank you so much, Flory. Let me just remind our audience members, those online and in the room as well, please remember you have note cards to be able to ask your questions. And also for our online audience, please feel free to send in your questions.
Okay, can I just remember one more thing that I forgot that's very important? This year in 2025, the African Growth and Opportunity Act is set to expire. And this will be another opportunity, its renewal and perhaps enhancements that will make it stronger and more effective. This is another area where we expect bipartisan support, as it's always had over the years, in collaboration with what the administration will be trying to do to promote mutually beneficial, perhaps even reciprocal trade relationships with Africa.
Thank you very much, Flory. Alex, let me come to you. So in your article, you discuss how 2024 was the first time that the African Union attended a G20 summit as a full member. This year, South Africa takes on the presidency of the G20. What opportunities do you see that exist to ensure that Africa gets the most out of its participation or its presidency of the G20 this year? Are there opportunities that exist as well for U.S. engagement here?
Thank you.
And global engagement,
and
I'd
global
like to ask.
Yeah. So thank you, Augie. I mean, congratulations on this. I was one of the contributors to the very first version a decade ago.
That's why we brought you back.
And it's like, it's amazing, yeah? It's amazing. And also that I can see some old friends I haven't seen for ages in the audience, like, Pato Tomi is sitting business class there right in the front. So, he's clearly very comfortable. So look, I want to build on what Flory was saying. There are a number of key areas, I think, that potentially overlap with the South African presidency of the G20. And as you've pointed out, one of the really exciting things is it's the first time the G20 meets on African soil. And you have that overlap of South African presidency and the African Union being member of the G20. President Ramaphosa of South Africa has highlighted that his priorities for G20 are inclusive economic growth, food security, and artificial intelligence. But there is, I think, one really key thing that Flory mentioned that I want to emphasize, which is that Ramaphosa, the South African president, also, and I quote him, said, "We will use the G20 to champion the use of critical minerals as an engine for growth and development in Africa." And so here I think there is an overlap with the America First Trump administration priorities that are emerging, and where the South Africans have a vision also of engagement. Put it another way, the South Africans have already been very engaged in debates around this, including being involved in the UN Secretary General's panel on critical energy transition minerals. And I think this kind of highlights the potential for multilateral discussion. But if it's on crude statistics, then you can see that South Africa and some of the minerals that it's producing there, manganese, platinum, iridium, is growing in billions of dollars, and their exports are significantly increasing to the United States. In 2022, it grew over 12% over the preceding 5 years. So again, I think this is an area of potential engagement between the United States and South Africa. Under the first Trump administration, there was some types of engagement, and the first Trump administration on more broadly on the African continent worked through the G20 for to support the debt suspension service initiative, DSSI, and then common framework. So again, I think there are some areas that Secretary of State Rubio will be able to work with African partners and the G20. And I think that's a really important opportunity. So we'll see, which US officials are involved in the G20. Mr. Ramaphosa has been very clear that South Africa has something that is world-class that President Trump would enjoy, and that is golf courses of South Africa too. It's made that remark as one of the incentives for President Trump to attend. And I think Pretoria's priority is to work out, where there are areas of disagreement, to just agree to disagree, and where there are areas that there can be cooperation to cooperate. I think the G20 is one of the multilateral fora that still is able to achieve things. Many of the global governance institutions are in very significant crisis. But as you can see with what's happened on debt relief and debt cancellation, I think the G20 is, in a slow way, but is able still to be playing an important role.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Alex, for those points. And I will come back to you with some follow-on questions on that. And I'm sure that there are others in the audience and online might have some follow-on questions. Let me turn to Jide in Addis. Jide, can you hear us?
Hi, Oge, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. I know it's really late in Ethiopia, so thank you for joining us for the conversation. Jide, when I look at your article, some will say 2024 really presented a mixed picture when it comes to multilateral engagement, multilateralism. As I mentioned at the top, we've seen the breakup of ECOWAS. We've also seen concerns on the East Africa and the Horn of Africa side with IGAD, as well as questions as well on SADC. But your article actually paints a more hopeful picture of multilateralism. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what makes you optimistic about multilateralism.
Okay, thank you so much, and good afternoon to the audience and panelists. And congratulations.
If I could just hold on, can we raise the volume a little bit so we can hear him in the room, if it's possible? Thank you.
Is this loud enough now?
Yes, it is. Great.
Okay. Well, congratulations on the publication. I echo what Alex said in terms of how important it is for us here on the continent. I think if one looks at multilateralism, you could easily identify 5 primary components of multilateralism. I think one has already been mentioned, trade, but the environment is important, human rights, peace and security, and the whole question of public health, which emerged very strongly during COVID and, of course, in the aftermath of COVID. And therefore, if one has to think about the prospect of multilateralism on the African continent, my optimistic view is grounded in some evidence that we have seen in 2024. And let me just mention 2 of them. In the area of peace and security, I think what is important to note on the African continent is that despite the fact that the continent would not be regarded as the most peaceful continent, based on various evidence that we all know about, it did not emerge as the least peaceful continent in 2024. And this is from data from the Global Peace Index. And I think it's an important point to make. Of course, this is not to discount the number of crises that we continue to face, and some of which you mentioned Oge, during your opening. But I thought it's important that we mention this point. The second is that in 2024, Africa also, alongside other continents, was characterized, or the year was characterized as a super election year. And it's really an important point to emphasize because in Africa, we witnessed 14 presidential elections, right? And out of those 14 presidential elections, we saw instances where 4 out of the 14 was, as a result, emerged as victory of the opposition political party. And I think this is really key because it shows a strong linkage between electoral results on the African continent and a yearning for people-centered governance. And the last point, which is often not talked about, is that we are increasingly seeing the emerging and primary role of national security forces in taking primary security responsibility over their security situation on the continent. Again, this has not really been discussed, but if you look at the Horn of Africa, with the winding down of peacekeeping missions, of course, it is now up to countries like Somalia to lead when it comes to asserting themselves and the security institutions in those countries. The same can be said for the Sahel as well, including within the EAS countries. And I think this is something that we should reflect on. The second point around multilateralism, which I consider to be quite key, is in the area of intra-Africa trade. It seems to me that Africa is demonstrating remarkable resilience when it comes to boosting intra-Africa trade. In 2024, despite the fact that intra-Africa trade remained low, we saw that there was 14% increase in intra-Africa trade on the African continent. Again, this is an important evidence to demonstrate that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is no longer an ambition. It is something that is working, and we are beginning to see that countries are boosting, even if slowly, their productive capacity to be able to trade amongst themselves. So I do see an optimistic picture when it comes to Africa. Africa is still, despite the challenges that we face, what we need to get to realizing some of the ambitions that have been set out by the African Union is leadership. And I think Alex made that point quite powerfully, that through platforms like G20, through platforms like the African Union, through platforms like bilateral engagement, including with the United States, we can begin to use our instrument of leadership to expand what I consider to be these islands of opportunities that have emerged in 2024. Thank you so much for listening, Oge, and of course, the panelists and audience.
Thank you very much, Jide. I'm actually going to come back to you in the second round to explore further this idea of islands of opportunity. But I want to, first of all, pause to see if we have any questions in the room. If there are any questions that have been written down thus far in the room or questions that we've received online before I move on to the second round of questions. Okay, while you're sorting through the questions, Flory, let me come back to you and pick up on a point that Jide made about this 14%. Oh, thank you for pointing that out, Flory. Abigail, I was waiting for the hard question to get to you about the Horn of Africa. That's why I was framing the hard question in my head to you on the Horn of Africa. Thank you, Flory, for the reminder. That's okay. So when you read Abigail's article, and I encourage everyone to read the short essay that Abigail has written for Africa Year in Review, there is a lot packed in there. Mm-hmm. There is obviously a lot going on in the Horn of Africa. Mm-hmm. And so could you paint a picture for us on what is happening in the Horn of Africa, how things are evolving over there? We saw the MOU between Ethiopia and Somaliland last year. We saw Turkey stepping in to negotiate different agreements towards the end of last year. We see the situation in Sudan. We see the situation in surrounding countries in the Horn of Africa and other regional actors too as well, engaging in the conversations. Can you paint a picture for us on what is going on in the Horn of Africa and areas for engagement in 2025?
Thank you, Olga, for that question, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to contribute to your Africa Year in Review publication. It is such a great publication. The summaries in there give you a grasp of what is happening on the continent. I encourage everybody to read it. And coming back to your question, I want to start hopeful, like Chidi has pointed out, like Africa is not the least peaceful continent. Having said that, I also want to highlight that last year, it was a different picture for the Horn of Africa. We started off with a memorandum of understanding between Ethiopia and Somaliland, and that the MOU was bringing Ethiopia to Somaliland to access the port, one of the Somaliland's port, and then in exchange, Ethiopia was to acknowledge Somaliland's independence. Somaliland is an autonomous state, semi-autonomous state of Somalia, the Somalia proper in the south, and with the capital Mogadishu. And that was not a good thing, because then the Somali officials in Mogadishu were like, you cannot do that. You need to rescind the MOU. And Addis Ababa refused to rescind that MOU, and things began to escalate for the Horn of Africa in 2024. When we look at February, the Somalis were already thinking of strategic partners to be able to put pressure on Addis Ababa or Ethiopia to be able to rescind that position. And the MOU is important in the sense that it was a message that Ethiopia was sending that they can do a deal with a semi-autonomous region within a country. It's like somebody comes to the United States and signs a memorandum of understanding with Maryland, for getting the capital in DC. So that was a big issue because it undermined the sovereignty of Somalia. And Somalia is already a fragile state, so to say. It's repairing itself and it's building relations with its federal states. And so that MOU really triggered a lot of things. And so by February, we saw Turkey also coming in, signing a military deal to rebuild Somalia as navy because it doesn't have a navy. And that's one of the things that it needs to be able to protect its waters. And still, Ethiopia did not rescind its deal with Somaliland. And then by June, Somalia announced that it was going to expel the 10,000 troops that Ethiopia has in Somalia. So for those that are keen followers, you would remember that Ethiopia has 10,000 troops stationed in Somalia because of its fight, helping Somalia fight Al-Qaeda-affiliated Al-Shabaab. So the troops are for the bilateral reasons. They have a bilateral engagement, but they're also under the African Union mission there, which Chidi did talk about earlier. And then fast forward to August, we see Egypt come in and signing another military deal with Somalia, which is now putting pressure in an already very fragile situation. The agreement with Egypt was that Egypt would supply weapons, light and heavy weapons, and 10,000 troops to replace the 10,000 troops that were going to be expelled, the Ethiopian troops. And so things were getting intense. And then somewhere in August, there was trilateral alliance with Egypt, Eritrea, and Somalia. So that, for a lot of people, indicated that they were getting to go to war. there was war that was brewing in the region. And that was concerning for a number of reasons, because Egypt and Ethiopia have some frictions over the Great Renaissance Dam that Ethiopia built and is functioning now, but also Egypt's access to the Nile River waters. And so the tensions were very high. And then there was also Turkey began some mediation back in July, August, which did not go anywhere. But thankfully, by December, there was an agreement that was signed between Somalia and Ethiopia, not to escalate further, but also granting access to discuss. The agreement was to agree to go to the table and discuss Ethiopia's access to Red Sea, and as well as to have a naval base. And so the agreement was that they'll come back for further technical details of what was called the Ankara Declaration. So that's where we're at now. So for me, as a keen observer, I'm like, okay, the issues that made the situation escalate in the first place were actually not tabled, because the Ankara Declaration didn't discuss, for instance, the issue of the MOU itself. The Ethiopia and Somaliland MOU is silent in the Ankara Declaration. And so that is the starting point of the issue. And so if that wasn't there, the prospects for further stability between the two countries are dire for me. That is worrying. Another issue that the Ankara Declaration did not address is Ethiopia's access to the sea in terms of building a naval base. They were discussing Ethiopia's access, import and access economically, but what about the naval base? Because that is another issue. Ethiopia has always wanted to have a naval base, and it had already had talks with France to how to build a naval base, but then because of the crisis that it has and the civil war in Tigray, that issue was put on hold. The French pulled out of that agreement. And then the other issue that the Ankara Declaration did not adequately resolve, perhaps which will be resolved in the third round of talks, which was supposed to happen either in February or before June, is the issues exactly where will the Ethiopian goods pass, because the port of Mogadishu or the port in Kismayo are repeatedly attacked by Al-Shabaab. So in terms of security and securely doing import and export through that region is very hard because of the Al-Shabaab attacks. And so there are still a number of things that the Ankara Declaration has to address in terms of really dealing with the situation and contributing to stability of the region. And like you said, this is just a small macrocosm of the issues that are happening in the Horn. I haven't even gotten into talking about Sudan, which has a lot of refugees, humanitarian issues there. A lot of people were hungry. A lot of people have been displaced. So many refugees going into South Sudan, into Central African Republic. And then also the impact of that on the neighboring countries such as South Sudan also has been tremendous, to say the least. And so these are the issues that the Horn of Africa is facing and that need a lot of urgent attention. But to take his credit, the Ankara Declaration was such a relief. And that's why I was saying that I'm starting at a more hopeful and positive note compared to last year, where things were up in flame and many observers were getting ready to see Ethiopia and Somalia go to war vis-a-vis the help of Egypt and Eritrea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much, Abigail. I will come back to you later on as you've painted that picture, more hopeful picture, as you said, as we go into 2025, to sort of elaborate on what opportunities you see. Yeah. So I will come back to you later on that, but just putting that out here so you can start thinking about that. We received a lot of questions from the audience. I'm going to do my best to summarize some of them, since a couple of the questions are pretty similar. Flory, I will start with you, just with some of the points that you made up front about, some initiatives under the first Trump administration with Prosper Africa, the Build Act. With the conversations that we've seen happening over the last few weeks, what are what are areas that you could highlight on some of the positives that we've seen from some of these programs, some of these initiatives, and thoughts about how we can, with this new administration, as it puts its team together on Africa and really begins to think about how it builds its U.S.-Africa trade strategy, what are some ideas from these initiatives that you think could be taken forward? Are there indications that you've seen that these could be continued?
Well, so first of all, I think that the U.S. administration is very focused on how we can support American businesses on the ground in Africa. There are lots of countries that are there, and in particular, U.S. companies tend to be at a disadvantage relative to Chinese companies that get a lot of support. Companies that are state-owned, et cetera, and the kind of packages that they put together. So one of the things that happened under Prosper Africa, and which I think the current Trump administration will continue to do, is to find ways to facilitate deals, commercial deals for U.S. businesses with their African partners across the continent. There are lots of opportunities. And if we can facilitate things, so financing, DFC, I think, has been doing a good job of being forward-leaning in terms of Africa, financing for infrastructure projects. That's very important, especially when they're regional, like the Libido Corridor. But there are others, frankly, that can be looked at. And I think that's one of the areas where we'll hopefully see continued efforts. How can you facilitate private sector-led growth in Africa, and where U.S. companies have a chance of competing with other companies from around the world, especially China? I think that that's an area we can look at. And then I think that Jide mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is a game changer for Africa, of course, expanding its intra-African trade. But it also means that it is creating one of the largest free trade markets available globally, and where U.S. companies now no longer have to go, sort of country by country. If you want to have a continental strategy, you can have a regional strategy, East Africa, Southern Africa. But if you wanted a continental strategy where you come in, you invest in one country or in a particular sector, and where you then find ways to take advantage of fewer barriers to trade in Africa, the removal of both tariff and non-tariff barriers is important. And I think it sets Africa up not only to do better amongst itself in terms of trade, but to pull in investments from key bilateral partners like the U.S. And I think the U.S. private sector, there isn't an African country I go to where they don't say, where are the U.S. companies? Where's the U.S. investment? And where I say, okay, two things. First of all, they are there, but if you want more U.S. investment, you have to have the kind of enabling environment, the rules, the laws, the regulations that make it easy for our companies to go there. And I think that institutions in the U.S. like DFC, like Exim Bank, TDA, and others are well-positioned, Commerce Department, the Foreign Commercial Service, are well-positioned to support U.S. companies doing business on the continent. That's what's needed. Mm-hmm. And that way we can benefit from what Africa has to offer the global economy.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. Alex, let me come to you. In your comments, you had mentioned, critical minerals. And there were a number of initiatives that were launched under the previous administration, and even before that too as well. So when we look at things like PGI, Lobito Corridor, and Alex, I know you follow Angola very, very, very closely.
Yeah.
And, the Mineral Security Partnership. What are avenues or opportunities you see for some of the progress that have been made to continue? Are there opportunities to continue moving forward with some of these initiatives?
Yeah. So the answer is definitely yes. And some of the Biden administration thinking and work on this, it was actually the baselines came out of the first Trump administration. Mm-hmm. So the original idea for Lobito is actually a Trump idea. It's a Trump idea. And various of the nominees that have gone very quiet to be Assistant Secretary of State, if they do get nominated and get through the hearings here, are very clear that maybe not all of Lobito, but some of Lobito will prevail. Particularly the one going through the line going through to the Democratic Republic of Congo for the copper and cobalt from there. I still think it's open for debate for the branch line to Zambia, whether that will happen or not. So I don't have any doubt on that. Last year, I wasn't there, but everybody said that the party to attend in Cape Town at the mining indaba, and as all of you may know, the mining indaba is in Cape Town right at the moment. Well, last year's one was that the US had brought the largest delegation ever and was really talking about that the US was back in town, back on the continent, looking at strategic and critical minerals, looking at critical infrastructure, and as kind of Florrie was alluding to, saying that there was choice. Didn't just need to be China, that the United States was seriously looking at the continent. I do think there are aspects of this that we need to look at. I would encourage the new administration to look at value addition, not just extraction, because at the end, the continent needs jobs, and expertise to stay on the continent, not just export the raw materials. But this is there are key opportunities. U.S. corporate America has been too shy on the African continent. And this is why the Corporate Council on Africa exists. Not for this particular marvelous publication, but I did write a piece looking at Africa this year. And what are the highlights of this year? And one of the highlights that I put is that the Corporate Council on Africa is hosting a massive investment conference in Luanda, Angola. And there's tremendous interest in that. And so I do think that it's important that the new administration engages on those business platforms that Florrie and others are providing. Because, Oggy, I guess we might talk more, but actually Africans want choice, yes? Mm-hmm. And so America is part of what I think we're moving into, which is an a la carte world. You look at the menu and you might want, I don't know, noodle soup, but you also want, a good burger, Maryland crab cakes, and jollof rice, and so on. This is the trend that I'm seeing developing on the continent. And I often get African policymakers asking me, why is corporate America as absent as it is when the Chinese, the Indians, the French, the British, the Emiratis, the Turks, as we've been hearing, are all strutting around doing their stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a great opportunity now for the United States, and with a new administration coming in, on how to do business and get opportunity. But it is also one continuity from a Democrat administration to a Republican one is geopolitical competition, and particularly containment and competition with China, and less so other countries like Russia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alex. Abigail, let me turn to you because there's a specific question here on how will tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia affect the AWESOM or AUSSOM, called AWESOM, implementation in the region.
Oh, this is a AU mission, right?
The AU mission.
I was like,
Awesome.
awesome.
It's an inside joke. We call it awesome.
Okay. You got me there. Well, yeah. So this has long been planned over the years, and I know that people focused on Somalia would be able to give more details. It's been long coming, and to think December, by end of December, the Somali government did come out saying that because of the Ankara declaration and the peaceful talks that they had with Ethiopia, they might not expel the 10,000 troops, Ethiopian troops. But I think that the tension will not impact AWESOM severely or significantly as people would expect, because this is a transition, a new mission that has been planned over the years, and I don't see how that would be very, very impactful. But I do see how the AU and the UN and IGAD will continue to play a bigger role in Somalia and in Ethiopia in terms of promoting regional cooperation and to foster positive engagement, just because the region, as I said, it is very volatile. And I just talked about interstate conflicts and tensions. We're talking about humanitarian crisis, climate-induced crisis, many other crises that need state attention, multilateral attention, bilateral attention. And she did talk about multilateral approaches that are being put forward. I think that those are the things that we need to think about more positively to engage. And I think the AU and IGAD and perhaps even other RECs would be engaging to foster that positive engagement and cooperation within the region. And this comes back, to another point that Chidi mentioned about Africans taking lead in terms of building the continent, fostering peaceful engagement, peace and security under, the broader global governance theoretical framework that Alex talked about, where African actors take responsibility. I mean, it's not about who is mediating, but it's about who is being impacted. And increasingly, we are seeing on the continent that African actors are taking positive steps to address the issues that impact themselves. And I think both Somalia and Ethiopia understand the fragility of the region and to better engage to foster development and peace and security in the region more positively. But I also do want to make a point that even in as much as I appreciate how the African Union and IGAD and have worked to foster cooperation between Ethiopia and Somalia and the entire region, we need to take a step back to think about, as a region, think about exactly what is going wrong using the instruments and the mechanism that have been put in place to address peace and security, and even, mostly peace and security. But what is it that has gone wrong? Evaluating those instruments, and then coming back to the table and drawing up a detailed, comprehensive plan that will foster peace and security in the region. Having something like a Horn of Africa 2040, whereby there's a roadmap of what we want to see in the region. And such tensions could also be part of that roadmap, leading the way in terms of building partnerships, building relationships, and strengthening regional integration.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Abigail. And on that, let me come back to you, Jide, and sort of this optimistic picture that you paint about multilateralism and these islands of opportunities that you mentioned. One, if you could highlight what some of these islands of opportunities, if you could highlight some of them, and also what needs to happen to make opportunity a reality? It's one thing to be an opportunity, but what needs to happen to actually make it a reality? How do we unlock these opportunities that exist on the continent?
Thank you very much, Oge. I think, some of these opportunities have been highlighted by Flori on private sector-led growth, by Alex on critical minerals. But a precondition for realizing all of these opportunities on the continent is governance. If you don't get governance right, it is very unlikely that you're going to realize some of these lofty ambitions for the continent. And in thinking about governance, I just would want to draw attention to what we have seen over the last 5 years and what seems to be a common denominator emerging over the last 5 years. In the last 5 years on the African continent, we have witnessed 8 military coups in West Africa, but also in Central Africa, to some extent in Sudan as well. We have also, as I mentioned previously, experienced 14 presidential elections in 1 year. So it seems to me that there is a certainty of political transitions in Africa. And that is the common denominator, whether it is constitutional transitions or unconstitutional transitions. And therefore, the most important question to ask as a way of contributing to the governance discourse on the African continent is how do you accompany countries in ways that build resilience and prevent crisis? Especially, how do you prevent the deterioration or the emergence of unconstitutional transitions? And this is why within UNDP Africa and in collaboration with the African Union, we have deliberately established what we refer to as the Africa Facility to support inclusive transitions, AFSIT. And we established this facility out of the recognition that it is important to accompany countries in their transition journey as a preventive mechanism and as a way of consolidating state resilience. What have we done over the last few years? In Chad, irrespective of the evolving situation, and through AFSIT, we supported the national dialogue processes where we brought together over 2,000 young men and women groups to be part of the political conversations. We are also supporting constitutional review in that country, and we supported the electoral process. In Niger, Mali, and in Burkina Faso, despite the sanctions by the African Union against these countries, despite the sanctions and of course the withdrawal from ECOWAS, we have used AFSIT as a strategic instrument for our collective support within the UN system by deploying strategic planners to help accelerate the transition roadmap in terms of its implementation. And finally, in Gabon, as you may know, we are seeing the government, the transitional administration just announced an election timeline. But prior to that, the African Union had requested that we use AFSIT as a basis for deploying monitors to observe the referendum in the country. These are all, evidence of some of the interventions that we do believe could create the foundation for supporting transition context. I think when we think about all of this, it is important that we continue to build knowledge around the transitions that are happening on the African continent because they are not monolithic. We continue to exchange in terms of knowledge with regional economic communities as well as with civil society groups, which will be very, very important. And we continue to use our effort to accompany countries as part of the implementation of our prevention agenda. And this is why, again, with the African Union, we are launching the Africa Transition Index as a way of really building a large constituency of knowledge that can help us in our intervention, or various interventions in these countries that I have just mentioned. Over back to you, Oge.
Thank you very much, Jide. And we have a lot of questions that have come in. I'm going to try to make sure I get to all of them. in 30 minutes. Alex, let me come back to you. In addition to sort of the conversations and the points that you made about the G20 and South Africa's presidency of the G20, we're also going to see the African continent featured in a number of summits this year. The EU-African Union Summit is planned for this year. In addition, there are several conferences as well. You mentioned the CCA conference that will be happening in Angola as well this year. And then we also see countries, Ethiopia and Egypt, and those who are applying to join BRICS if they haven't joined already. So all these events are influenced by a lot of regional geopolitics. It will have its impact. They will have impacts on Africa's role in this evolving global arena. Can you share your thoughts? Because I know you are watching a lot of events and forums that will happen this year.
Yeah.
Can you share your thoughts on what you're watching and what impact you think all of this will have on Africa's role in this evolving space?
Yeah, so as you say, there's lots of meetings and summits in addition to the G20 coming up. I suppose one of the original ones is coming round again, and that's the Tokyo International Conference for African Development. So it predates the Chinese version, FOCAX and all the rest of it. And that this year it will be in Japan. So that's one. And then next year, for the first time, the French are holding their next Africa France summit in Nairobi, Kenya. That's telling you something, yes? That for the first time, the French are holding their Africa summit in an Anglophone country. And that's what I think we're seeing is that we are seeing in this world of multipolarity, a la cartism, we're seeing forum shopping and moving around. So I don't know, Ogi, if you watched, but Ghana joined the La Francophonie as a full member last year. It wasn't in here as one of the achievements, but and Angola became an observer of the La Francophonie with ambition to become full member. So even where you have those sorts of forum that were created to help countries with their loss of empire, so I think that's how you could describe La Francophonie. The Commonwealth for the UK is a similar sort of mechanism. And I'm sure you noticed a few years ago that both Gabon and Togo joined the Commonwealth, and Angola has applied to join. So at all sorts of different levels, you have this kind of picking and mixing, and the BRICS is another example of that. As you know, last year, Ethiopia and Egypt joined. I've just flown straight from Algiers to here to be with you. Well, in Algeria, they still want to be a member of the BRICS, yes, and so does Nigeria. So we have a number of other kind of middle forums, I suppose, that African countries are deciding is there an advantage to. A different way of looking at it is the Portuguese version of this, the CPLP. You're suddenly finding a lot of Central and Eastern European states becoming observers of it. Now, they're doing that more because they're interested, like Flori, in business opportunities. And so they're finding that these forums are a good networking opportunity to try and make business connections. And there, I think, is what's really central to all of these, is that actually it's about trying to attract foreign direct investment and trade and network in smaller organizations than the really vast ones like the UN General Assembly. And again, let's just turn this finally back to the United States. This is why the new administration needs to engage, because consciously African countries, many of them, do want a mixture of partnerships. And if the United States goes into a very retreating position, focusing on other parts of the world like Central and South America, it will create a vacuum which others will fill. And I do wonder, particularly in places like Central Africa, whether the reality of the minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo are going to be so important for the global future, for energy transition, that we may, in 10 years' time, start looking at Central Africa in a way that we're looking at the Gulf states at the moment. And I do think this is where strategic foresight needs to come into play also, and maybe inform policymakers in Washington about the direction of travel. Because international relations is changing very quickly. And for many, Africa is up there at the top of the menu, not just something that you might choose very occasionally.
Thank you very much, Alex. And from there, let me move back to the Horn of Africa. And I know we saw this question coming. But Abigail and Alex, I know you follow this issue closely too as well. But this question is, what would the recognition of Somaliland mean for stability in the Horn of Africa?
Glad you got asked the question.
I'll give a short answer to that. I mean, I don't think that it will be a big change because Somaliland has been stable, and I don't think it has impacted any negotiations, anything that is going in, apart from the fact that it has been a safe haven for a number of Somalis to go, both within Somalia and the diaspora. And so I don't think that it will make a big difference. The big difference will be to the Somaliland people themselves who want to be independent. They have been semi-autonomous for 30 years. I don't see how their independence will make a difference because there is not any substantial impact from Somaliland because of the contribution, the contribution to the broader peace and security and development that they make has not been substantive. I think that the contribution has been mostly in terms of to the Somali people themselves. So I don't see any substantial impact in the broader scheme of things for the region. I could be wrong, but I don't know, Alex?
Look, I worry that, for example, if there was a US recognition of Somaliland, it would open up all sorts of disputes in the Horn of Africa, including other regions that would decide that they might want the same experience. And so it is one of the things that, when I was writing about this year, that worried me most of all, if that came to pass. It's different from under Trump 1, the recognition of Western Sahara as part of Morocco. This is a lot more problematic on what the tremors that would come out from it. I was hopeful that what you described, Abigail, about the Turkish mediation processes of that had calmed things down related to this. So let's see. And of course, the Horn of Africa is also a forensic area of focus of Gulf and states and the Arabian Peninsula. There's another aspect that I suspect will happen with a Trump administration, which is that it will try and subcontract quite a bit of focus on the Horn and Sudan to kind of Middle East Gulf players, and that in its own will also add additional complications, in my view.
Thanks for that. So let me come back to a question on governance. Jide, you had highlighted the importance of governance. Moving forward, I would love to hear your suggestions, and from others on the panel too as well, on how we can keep democracy and human rights on the agenda. How do we keep that on the agenda and discussions beyond just trade? And we know trade is really important, but how do we ensure that we keep democracy and human rights on the agenda? Jide, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think increasingly when you think about the whole notion of state legitimacy, it is significantly being redefined on the African continent and elsewhere as well. State legitimacy is no longer defined in terms of regime security. It is in fact being defined in terms of human security. And a precondition for state survival, increasingly as we have seen in different contexts across Africa, is the necessity for promoting human security. And this is a wake-up call to governments across the continent and in fact beyond. I think the second point is around the social contract. The social contract between communities and between the state and citizens. I think this is really an important point to emphasize. I've just come back from Maiduguri in northeast Nigeria, and the whole question around social cohesion is one that is being reinvented as a way of promoting enduring peace is within those communities. And I think often when we think about the notion of social contract, we often think about these vertical relationships. I think the horizontal relationship is very important. And lastly, I think, we need to move development away from political capitals or commercial capitals. I think in Africa, we do have 270 million people living in borderland communities. And these are areas that are most vulnerable, right? And so if we are thinking about development and macroeconomic indicators, it's not enough to just think about Lagos, Abuja, or Nairobi. It's also very essential that we begin to think about what happens in borderland communities, either in the northeast of Nigeria or elsewhere in Southern or East Africa. And I think that is what will provide us with sufficient boost in terms of how we realize sustainable development on the African continent. Back to you.
Thank you, Jide. Did anyone want to add points on that too as well?
I'd like to just add the perspective that there is a relationship between good governance, rule of law, democracy, a commitment to market-oriented policies. There's a link between that and being able to attract investment and to develop good partners globally. I think it's true across the continent, like with each other, but I think that for foreign direct investment, for FDI, those issues come to play for them, and there are any number of organizations that their review of those kinds of issues, human rights and democracy and rule of law and respect for commercial policies and engagement and there are two. So on the U.S. government side, just as an example, we will get asked sometimes by countries that are not eligible for MCC compacts, for example, like, what do we have to do? Well, the criteria are there, and they cut across these other areas as well. You'll get countries who do well, perhaps on the economic indicators, but don't do well on some of the social indicators and the human rights and democracy indicators. So you do have a link between, if you want to get hundreds of millions of dollars, MCC has invested over $11 billion across 17 African countries in its 21-year history. There could be more investment. It's often in infrastructure, right? And it's grants. It's not loans like they've been saddled with by other countries. But you have to meet the criteria, and many of them fall into this area. And then there's the private sector. The U.S. private sector is reticent. It is it has a perception of risk in Africa, which, I personally believe is not totally aligned with reality. So there are risks in investing in African nations, but I think the perception of risk in Africa is actually not quite accurate. And one of the things we do, including, and thank you, Alex, for mentioning the Corporate Council on Africa, U.S.-Africa Business Summit, one of the things that we are very intent on doing is bringing together African government and U.S. government and African and U.S. private sector to bring them together so that they can explore what those opportunities are and who's ripe for investment and who's not, which projects and which sectors are ripe for investment. And again, as I said earlier, I think this is a great time for U.S. businesses to be looking at Africa, especially if you're trying to build resilience into your supply chains. Alex mentioned critical minerals, and this is, an important point. 70% of the processed critical minerals that we need in the U.S. for our own economic security now comes from China. So what is the way that the U.S. private sector and the U.S. government can do something about that? Well, we can invest in, through loans and, addressing risk in processing those critical minerals, the lithium and the cobalt and so forth, in Africa, where the products are, and then being able to capture more of that for our own market, those processed minerals. I think that certainly would support an approach that is beneficial both to the Africans, because that gives them the beneficiation and processing there on the ground of their own natural resources, but it also does something for us as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Can I make
Alex,
just
you wanted to add?
myself or Abigail first?
You go first.
Okay, you're in control here.
You go
Yes.
first.
You're in command.
course.
So a couple of points. One is just to really underline and emphasize Jidé's point about the absolute fundamental importance of human security and moving away from over-focus on elite security. I mean, this is something also in terms of U.S. investments in the Sahel that we saw under both, Trump administrations, but also the Biden administration, of maybe an overemphasis on training for elite security. And so an unintended consequence was that fragile straits, in effect, became brittle ones, because the only institution that populations began to believe might have solutions to a number of the crises that you have in the Sahel, climate change, demographics, terrorism, was the military, believing the military could provide solutions. And so you do have popular support for coup d'etat. That's not a good thing. And Jidé's talked a bit about the thinking in UNDP and the African Union of how to kind of move from that. So that's the first point. The second point is that American businesses, where they are in the continent, big corporate American companies have signed up to all sorts of different principles and guidelines that do engender and encourage human rights. So, the UN guiding principles, the Ruggie principles for business and human rights, the UN, so the voluntary principles for business and security, and I won't go on a long list of them, but they are all relevant for supply chain resilience. And what, for example, I mean, I know that the Chargé d'Affaires of Mozambique is in the room here. Mozambique is a good example where, because Exxon, Total, Gemfields, and various others were saying, we insist on these principles as a tenet to our investment, the Mozambican government has then, it's got developing a national action plan for the UN guiding principles. It's signed up to the voluntary principles for security and human rights. It's signed up to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and a number of these things. So this shows the influence and importance of corporate America also by being engaged in these marketplaces. Final point, I was involved in a mapping exercise with Mozambican colleagues from various research institutions, and we were able to go into Exxon, Total, Gemfields, so Western companies that were investing, but we also went on to Chinese business enterprises. And the Mozambican colleagues saw the massive difference of kind of how are labor treated, what are the kind of the integrity of the supply chains. That speaks for itself. So again, the absence of corporate America, I think, it makes the continent poorer, actually, in terms of the governance and human rights broader benefits of having these international standards mainstream through corporate interaction.
Thank you.
Can I just say, though, there is a misperception, and I have to say this, that U.S. companies are absent on the continent. And, you know, CCA has members who have been there 40, 50, 60 years, 100 years. And so that's not to say that we should not be more assertive, that there are not more opportunities that American companies should be taking advantage of, and with support from U.S. institutions like DFC and Exim Bank and others could in fact do more. But it is not, it is not accurate to say that we are absent on the continent. And so we just have to change that narrative. I every time I hear that, I'm like, we're not absent on the continent, but we could.
You got to shout louder, Florrie, because there's a perception of you're not as active as people want you to be.
Right, we're not as active as we want to be
Yeah.
or need to be,
Yeah.
which we totally agree.
Okay, Florrie, we're
And
going to
so-
have that side conversation
Yes.
between you and Alex.
But we're not absent. We're not
Abigail,
absent.
did you want to add a few points?
Yes, I do. And yes, to your conversation, you need to change the strategy of how you are present on the continent. So for me, I'm coming at democracy.
We're ganging up on you, Florrie.
For good reason. But to add to the conversation on democracy, I'm coming at it in terms of the leadership succession and democratic transitions. The issue, I think, for me, has been lack of a plan for successions. A lot of our leaders stay for a very long time, and there are notable leaders that we can count on the continent that have been there in leadership as presidents. I'm talking about executive leadership here, and they don't leave. And we don't see a clear succession, a clear path for them to pass down the mantle. And then down the line, it is obvious that they have to leave. But because there's no plan, they haven't worked on a plan for several years. For some reason, maybe they thought they would, die in office or never die. We end up in a crisis of transition because we don't know who is going to take over. And some of these countries are plunged in a crisis or conflict because of the lack of planning or lack of proper succession. I can name several countries, but one of the countries, for instance, Sudan. Omar Bashir was there for a very long time. He had to be pushed out, and then now we are where we are because there was no, I would argue, there was no clear succession. But then even when that, problematic succession happens, the transition to a more democratic path that highlights and supports human security and human rights is also lacking because of the way that leaders come into power. Once they stay long, they're undermining human security, human rights, because they want to be kept in power. And once that succession begins, the transition, there are no safeguards, there are no proper institutional frameworks to protect civilians. And that's why, for instance, what we have in Sudan is happening. So much misery among the citizens is because of such lack of proper succession, lack of planning, and just not wanting to leave, changing constitution left, right, and center. Those are some of the challenges for peace and security, for governance, even for human rights. And then there's also another thing that is becoming a challenge on the continent. Once our leaders refuse to leave, they hire private security. If the other Western countries, devolve themselves from engaging with those partners, with them, they find alternatives. And I appreciate, Alex, you talking about, Africa has an a la carte menu of who to engage with. It is a great thing once it is positively used.
Yeah.
But oftentimes it is not.
Yeah.
In some
That's a fair
cases,
point.
Yeah. If the U.S. doesn't support the regime, we have an alternative country. Russia comes in with, we have other private actors being brought in to prolong that leaders stay in power, and they continue undermining democracy, they continue undermining human security, and also generally the citizens. So for me, I'm looking at it in terms of leadership transitions, leadership successions, and how those can create pathways, if they're properly done, for democracy and transitioning to democracy for those that have not been democratic for a very long time.
Okay, thank you very much, Abigail. I'm mindful that we have only 5 minutes, so I want to apologize in advance that there are just so many questions, so many good questions, and that's the thing with a lot of our conversations with the Africa program.
Right.
There's so many questions. I wish we had more time, but I'm going to do one last round with the panel and ask you to please give your closing remarks at the same time. Again, remember we have 5 minutes. I think all of you have highlighted that things are changing rapidly. It's different on the continent. There are several actors on the continent. And just the discussions on the future of development assistance, what that looks like moving forward. Development assistance on the humanitarian side, on the side of investment, trade and investment, on investing in infrastructure. Would love to hear your thoughts as you close on ideas that could be shared with the current administration, U.S. administration, as we think about development assistance on the continent, and how to engage with different African countries and African partners as well. So I'd love you to share those thoughts as you provide your closing remarks. I'm looking at all of you and I'm trying to figure out who wants to go first. Jide, you look as if you want to go first.
Yeah.
Sure, I am happy to go first. I think, maybe it's too early to tell what the future looks like, but I can also gain a lot of inspiration from the past. And in terms of development finance, here are 3 opportunities that I see. The first is an opportunity in the area of diversification significantly of development finance and development assistance. And that in many ways will change the development governance landscape. I think this is really something that is already emerging on the continent with, very diverse development actors willing to support various development programming. I think the second point is what has been said repeatedly in today's conversation is the expansion of private sector-led development interventions. And I think it's important that we begin to see development solutions in terms of investment as opposed to seeing development challenges in terms of aid. And this is really going to be the future of sustainability as we think about development assistance. So how is it that the private sector can become the sustainability pathway for development interventions? And the last point is government cost sharing interventions. I think it is no longer the case that we should assume that African government lack resources for pioneering development initiatives. I think there are resources within the continent that can be harnessed and that can be utilized in ways that can also sustain development action. And I think here is where we can use government agency as an opportunity for not only catalyzing development, but for sustaining development gains. So how is it possible for government to cost share some of the development investments that would be made. And we're already seeing some examples. In DRC, we have the PUDC model, which brings development to various communities. The government has invested over $100 million there. We're seeing the same in Gabon emerging, working where the government is also doing a similar model. It happened in Senegal. So I think the idea that government in Africa are passive and do not have the agency for development is not one that is valid in 2025. We should just find those opportunities there and see how they can be expanded. Back to you, and thank you once again.
Thank you, Jide.
For this opportunity, and I look forward to further discussion in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jide. Alex?
Okay, so 4 quick points. One is that the development finance institutions are increasingly important, and some of them are in the global north, BIA, the UK one, but the attraction of vehicles like the African Finance Corporation based out of Lagos and the work they're doing, and likewise the importance of foreign direct investment. Second one is that in terms of humanitarian response, but also thinking of new paradigms for development, there are new players with plenty of money, deep pockets that are emerging. And so the United Arab Emirates at the moment, I know, is mapping what everybody else is doing on the continent and looking at where they may provide value addition in terms of humanitarian response. The traditional players, including the US, will continue to be really important in terms of, and this is the third point, in terms of responding to classic emergencies, climate shocks or kind of displacement because of conflict. So that will continue. And then finally, just like the debate that's now happening here of the merger of a development agency into a foreign ministry, this is something that's been going on as a trend within Europe for a while. It's happened in Canada. And actually there is learning about how that can still be effective and still provide good development and humanitarian responses. So in all these cases, the initial process is traumatic of trying to merge two institutions back together again sometimes. And there is also and it's not so dissimilar from corporate mergers in my experience, but the results can have beneficial results longer term, but it will take about a decade, I think, in terms of that kind of cultural assimilation that takes place.
Thank you, Alex. Abigail Flory, would you like to add?
Yes. For me, I'm thinking more of partnerships, meaningful partnerships for the U.S. engagement with Africa. Why do I say so? In a different forum, I have been reflecting a lot on how the U.S. has engaged with the continent from the 1960s. And in that research, I found that it has mostly been from a military perspective, military engagement, and looking at insecurities for good reason that would impact the U.S. For instance, the Sahel region has been a big place where the U.S. has engaged. Horn of Africa here and then, yes, but it has mostly been militarization, and it has been an engagement that has been one-sided, where the U.S. mostly comes to the table with certain agenda, but meaningful engagement and meaningful partnership with Africa to foster development, and especially in peace and security, because the security of Africa is interlinked with that of the U.S., especially when you think about the many jihadist movements that have now sprouted in the Sahel region, and the opening up that has happened with the conflict in Sudan, where now you can easily see the jihadist groups making their way through Sudan and to the Middle East. So that makes sense in terms of peace and security, but coming to the table with African partnerships, asking the question, how can we meaningfully engage as equal partners? I think that has been lacking with the U.S. engagement with the continent. Mm-hmm. And for good reasons, we've also seen, because of the feeling by many African actors and elites of disparagement, they've been turning more and more to other partners like Gulf states. Alex has highlighted that a lot, and we are seeing more and more Gulf states engagement. I'm talking about Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. Of course, Saudi Arabia is even leading some of the mediation with Sudan. And so that has been a critical issue with U.S. and Africa engagement. And then there's BRICS to look out for.
I know. Thank you, Abigail. I am mindful because I don't want them to cut off the live stream, but that point of
all right.
meaningful engagement and meaningful partnership. Flori, I will give you the last
Thank you.
word.
Thank you. So on the point of development assistance, I think it's important to remember that years ago, prior, for example, to AGOA, the major way in which the U.S. engaged with Africa is through development assistance, ODA, aid. And, you know, the transition has been from aid to trade, right? That's a part of why we put AGOA in place, and then trade to investment. And I think that when we're thinking about development assistance, at least from where we're sitting, we want to promote more of the idea that it should support Africa, its capacity to actually engage more in the global trade and investment environment. And frankly, moving from aid to trade to investment also has two-way benefits, because now it's not just what the U.S. is doing for Africa, but it's also the ways in which U.S. companies are also benefiting, deals that are being made that are beneficial to U.S. companies, businesses, workers, et cetera. So I think that shift in how we think about it is important. And I just want to, partnerships, but I was thinking more about public-private partnerships and co-financing. And I'll mention just quickly two partnerships that happen, one between Exim Bank and Afrexim Bank, where they have come together to try to support U.S. businesses working with African partners on the ground in key sectors, health, infrastructure, energy, et cetera. Another one is the MCC collaboration with Africa 50. So I just want to say that co-financing and public-private partnerships and a change in how we perceive what we're doing, not for Africa, but with Africa, is important. And I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Flori. What we're doing, not for Africa, but with Africa, is a very good way to end this. And again, I apologize for those questions that I was not able to get to, but please join me in thanking our amazing panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, GA. Good night.